Water down.
Being in a good mood is really great, and most languages have lots of words to describe the experience, like happy, cheerful, joyful, and so on. The same goes for the languages of the Bible. In ancient biblical Hebrew, there's a variety of words, like simcha, sason, or gil. In the Greek New Testament, there's kara, euphrosune, or agaliasis. Each word has its own unique nuance, but they all basically refer to the feeling of joy and happiness. Now, what makes these biblical joy words interesting is noticing the kinds of things that bring happiness, and also seeing how joy is a key theme that runs through the whole story of the Bible. Let's start with sources of joy. On page 1 of the Bible, God says that this world is very good. And so naturally, people find joy in beautiful and good things of life, like growing flocks or an abundant harvest on the hills. The poet of Psalm 104 says, "A good bottle of wine is God's gift to bring joy to people's hearts." People find joy at a wedding or in their children. There's even a Hebrew proverb that compares the joy that perfume brings to your nose with the joy a good friend brings to your heart. However, human history isn't just a joy fest. The biblical story shows how we live in a world that's been corrupted by our own selfishness. It's marked by death and loss. And this is where biblical faith offers a unique perspective on joy. It's an attitude God's people adopt, not because of happy circumstances, but because of their hope in God's love and promise. So when the Israelites were suffering from slavery in Egypt, God raised up Moses to lead them into freedom. And the first thing the Israelites did was sing for joy. Even though they were in the middle of a desert, they were vulnerable, the promised land was still far away, they rejoiced anyway. Later biblical poets looked back on this story and they remembered how the Lord caused his people to leave with joy, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. This joy in the wilderness, this was a defining moment, a way of saying that the joy of God's people is not determined by their struggles, but by their future destiny. This theme appears later in Israel's story, when Israel suffered under the oppression of foreign empires. The prophet Isaiah looked for a day when God would raise up a new deliverer like Moses. That's when those redeemed by the Lord will return to Zion with glad shouts, with eternal joy crowning their heads. Happiness and joy will overtake them. And while the Israelites waited, they chose joy to anticipate their future redemption. This is why it's significant that when Jesus of Nazareth was born, it was announced as good news that brings great joy. We're told that Jesus himself rejoiced and gave thanks to God his Father when he began to announce the kingdom of God. He even taught his followers the same joy in the wilderness, saying, "When people reject you or persecute you for following me, rejoice, be very glad, because your reward is great in heaven." After his death and resurrection, Jesus commissioned his followers to go out and announce the good news that he was the risen King of the world. And as they did so, the early Christian communities were known for being full of joy, even when they were persecuted. Like when the Apostle Paul was sitting in a dirty Roman prison, he could say that he's chosen joy, even if he gets executed. He called this the joy of faith, or joy in the Lord. He believed it was the gift of God's Spirit, a sign that Jesus' presence is with you, inspiring hope in the midst of hardship. And when you believe that Jesus' love has overcome death itself, joy becomes reasonable in the darkest of circumstances. Now, this doesn't mean that you ignore or suppress your sorrow. That's not healthy or necessary. Paul often expressed his grief about missing loved ones or losing friends or his own freedom. He called it being full of sorrow and yet rejoicing. As he acknowledged his pain, he also made a choice to trust Jesus, that his loss wouldn't be the final word. This is very different from the trite advice to turn that frown upside down. Christian joy is a profound decision of faith and hope in the power of Jesus' own life and love. And that's what biblical joy is all about.
All right, come in. Knew that already, huh?
It's a joy to be with other believers.
It is. All right, well, then let's turn to Genesis chapter 39. We ended up last week, Joseph had been falsely accused by the wife of his Egyptian master, because Joseph had remained righteous in captivity. As he got falsely accused, all that sort of thing. He just wouldn't sleep with his master's wife, and so she loosed her venom and on him by lying to her husband about him. She accused Joseph of doing the very thing of which she herself was guilty. Potiphar promptly, in his anger, throws Joseph into prison. Throws him into prison, and this is where we are. 39. Down there at verse, I'll just say verse 20. Let me just read it to you since it's short tonight. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. So this really is the very bottom of his descent. We talk about the descent into exile. This is the very bottom or descent into exile. He couldn't get any lower than this right here, being away from home, away from his family, in the land of Egypt, falsely accused, and living in prison. He's about as alone and far away as he could get. So very quickly, it's been brought out out here that man has not changed at all during all of this time. Mankind. Human trafficking is still a huge business, and it's a problem in this world today. This story is about someone who had been kidnapped and forced against his will to a place where he has no identity, he has no money, he has no family, he has no connections, he has no support people or groups. He's extremely vulnerable, and things just were really going pretty terrible for him, even though it says that God was with him. As Tim Mackey says this is not an ancient reality, talking about this human trafficking. This is a reality that has been the lived experience of millions of humans up until now. It's happening right now. It's a horrifying thing to think about what this kind of experience would be like. And I would also note that this kind of hits closer to home than maybe what we'd like to think. Hundreds of thousands of people are constantly crossing our borders. Some of them are crossing by their own free will. They want to come. Some are coming against their will, having been enslaved by the sex and drug cartels, sometimes being given over by their own family members. And so this is happening even in our own country, this human trafficking sort of thing. So this historically is what humans do to each other. Before labor laws were enforced in our country, working conditions in certain jobs were just plain hazardous to one's health. Railroad workers. Y'all say it. Ready?
Railroad
workers.
Okay, and coal miners, harbor workers, you get it. Okay, and then child labor laws were enacted as well. Remember, it used to be children worked hard, and it's interesting that the same element in Joseph's story is the same element in Abraham's story with Hagar. Hagar was a slave, a woman slave. It's a story about how Abraham treated an Egyptian immigrant wife and how he banishes her to basically to death. And so you see the parallels there. Joseph is just the reversal of this in that now he is an immigrant in Egypt, being treated poorly, and being sent to the pit. Tim Mackey says, biblical stories, if we can learn how their language works, they're offering the most realistic and raw portrait of human patterns of behavior. More raw than most literature I ever read. That's what this theme is about. It's about all the way back to the first exile with Adam and Eve from the garden and how God informs them of the sad consequences of their behavior. So from the very beginning of Scripture, we've been told that there will be people who will align themselves with God and His will, and then there will be people who align themselves just opposite of that, to oppose God and His purposes and His will. And the result is there is an endless battle between the two. And it's been that way from virtually the very beginning. So we go back a little bit. Jacob believes that his son has been eaten by wild animals. His son is actually in Egypt and in prison. In a way, what he believes is true, isn't it? It's just that the wild animals are his very sons, Joseph's brothers. They did, in essence, consume him. And as far as his dad is concerned, he's dead. But there's a bit of good news in the story. Even at the end of chapter 39, Joseph is at the lowest part of his exile. And in verse 21, we're told that, quote, the Lord was with Joseph. Now, those are some of the sweetest words you'll ever want to hear, especially if you're in a dark place yourself. Notice that God, being with Joseph, did not prevent it from happening. That's a hard reality, and it goes against the theology that is out there and being proclaimed today. So that if you are with God and God is with you, nothing bad really will ever happen to you, and if it does, it's because you messed up somehow. But God didn't prevent it from happening, but it didn't mean that God was not with Joseph. And you have to wrestle with that a little bit, don't you? You and I can be in the middle of the consequences of this sin-soaked world, and God can be with us and not prevent the things that we would categorize as bad from happening. Does that shake your faith? Does it do something to what you think about the character of God? Well, this is why we study the Word of God, so that we can get a grasp on the reality of what's really happening. So put this story into context with the previous stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they repeatedly fell short of God's expectations. They were human failures many times. But they continued to have faith in God, but they fell nonetheless. But God was faithful. Joseph is presented, but we don't get any reports of him failing. He's always responding in trust and dependency and obedience to the will of God, is he not? The story is about God's overriding commitment and faithfulness to his promises. And that's where our hope and joy is founded. That's where it's kept, isn't it? It's not in the circumstances around us. It's not in the people that we're with. It's in our hope and our trust is in the promises that God has made. And that's where Joseph is. So Joseph comes along and he exemplifies what God said to Abraham back in chapter 18, verse 19. And God says to Abraham, "For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." So you see what's happening here, okay? Keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. Why? So that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Now, how does that make you feel that you might be a part of God's plan in bringing about a promise, but it may not be necessarily for your comfort, but it may be for the benefit of God's will being done and the fulfillment of his promises? So what we see here, there is a human part to be played out in fulfillment of God's promises. Did you hear that? You see the role that Joseph is playing. You see the role that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is playing in this. There's a human part to be played out in fulfillment of God's promises. And this is part of God's sovereignty in choosing to do it this way. As one commentator put it, when God's people respond with righteousness and justice, as does Joseph, their way and God's blessing will prosper. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And you go, oh, wow, the sun is beginning to shift a little bit here, isn't it? He's been going down. He's had this hard time with Potiphar's wife. And, Joseph has gone through a series of descents, down, 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 down. Now he's going to go through a series of ascents. He's going to begin to go up, up, up. Why? Because this story is given to us in part to let us see both God's faithfulness in spite of human failure and at the same time the necessity of an obedient and faithful human response. God uses human instruments. Why? We don't know, but he's chosen to do so. And so Joseph is this obedient, faithful human responder. And he's using him in this situation. And so he may be in the jail, but God was with him. And God is going to use this situation to bring about his will, going all the way back to Abraham. Okay? So the two, God's faithfulness in spite of human failure and an obedient human response, those two are knitted together by God's will and design. And it's exemplified time and time and time again. We've seen it over and over and over in Genesis through all of these men. John Sailhammer says the theological emphasis is remarkably similar to that of the New Covenant theology of Jeremiah 31 through 34, and Ezekiel 36, 22, 32, where the two themes of divine sovereignty and human responsibility are woven together by means of the concept of God's Spirit giving a person a new heart. A new heart given by God that responds with obedience and faith. You see how those two work together. God gives a person a new heart. That heart responds in obedience and faith. So it can hardly be accidental that in all of Genesis, only Joseph is described as one who is filled with the Spirit of God. Chapter 41, verse 38. The same theological emphasis is found in Deuteronomy 30, where Moses grounds his hope in the future of God's promises in the divine work of giving a person a new heart. This is how God has chosen to do so. He's working with human failures. But what's he doing? He's going way beyond, and he's creating a new creature, isn't he? He's giving a new heart. And he says, I'm going to place my Spirit in you. Those sorts of comments. So here's Joseph. He's a man that can be described as having the Spirit of God. He's described as righteous and obedient. He's got it all together, right? He's good looking. He's skillful. He's got all this stuff going for him. And look where he is. He is in jail through no fault of his own. He was captured and sold into slavery by his own flesh and blood through no fault of his own. And now he's in a foreign land in a prison through no fault of his own. So the thing that makes Joseph different, the thing that makes Joseph righteous is the thing that gets him into trouble. How does that make you feel? Well, if I just do what is right, everything will be great. Right?
No good deed goes unpunished.
That's right. Well, there you go. And righteousness goes against those who are opposed to God and his will and his purposes. And there's Joseph. He's about as opposite of that as you can get. But the major difference is that God is with Joseph in prison. Just like he will be with Paul and Silas in the jail later in the New Testament. Other instances in the Scripture. So this is really counterintuitive to much of the theology that's going around today. that you can say, well, there's Joseph in prison. We think about Daniel. We think about Paul and Silas. We think about these, and Paul in jail and all these things.
Jesus on the cross.
Jesus on the cross and Jeremiah, lots of different, all the way through the scriptures. And that just goes counter to the theology that's going around today, isn't it? Much of it. But the difference is what? God's presence. God is with, like with Joseph, God was with him. And where was he? In jail. In jail. So when Joseph first gets to Egypt and is sold to Potiphar, God is with him. We're told that. And he rises to the top of that job he was in. Okay? Now he's in prison, and God is still with him, has never left him nor forsaken him. And the pattern is repeated, isn't it? Even though he's in prison, he's now found favor with the chief jailer. So what happened with Potiphar in that he gave everything to Joseph's charge, the chief jailer now does the very same thing in giving him charge over all the prisoners. Quote, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. Potiphar didn't concern himself with anything except for the next meal he was going to eat. And verse 23 says, the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge. Why?
Because the Lord was with him.
Because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Where do you want to be in this world? Wherever God is, right? Wherever the Lord is, that's where you want to be. You want him with you, you to be with him wherever you go, even if it's in prison or wherever it happens to be. Proverbs 16:3 says, commit your works to the Lord and your plans will be established. And so we see this exemplified in Joseph, do we not? Even though he has been abused, he is still committing his way to the Lord. He's still working hard. He's still giving it his all. Psalmist 90 says, let your work appear to your servants and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm the work of our hands. So we learned the lesson. We learned the lesson. We don't look to the physical circumstances of our lives to determine our spiritual condition. But that's what we do we not? We get in a bad way, we get in a bad fix, and all of a sudden we begin to grade maybe ourselves on our spiritual condition. Joseph was innocently exiled. God turned an intended evil against Joseph into something good. That's a marvelous place to be associated with God turning evil into good, isn't it? So God was with him. God was with Joseph, and he gives success to his work in that situation. Joseph knows that God is with him, and he will speak of it later when he will tell his brothers that what they intended for evil, God made it work out for the good, what? And to save many lives. Are you willing to endure some discomfort, some humiliation, whatever it happens to be, so that many lives could be saved? Could you do it joyfully? Can you still trust in God if you're at the bottom of the pile? If you're like Joseph, exiled, everything that you have has been taken away from you. Can you still trust God in those situations that he is going to use it to fulfill his promises and maybe to save many lives? It's a tough place to be, isn't it? But Joseph knows that he's with him. So like Daniel in exile, Joseph suffers for doing what is right, but God turns the evil done to him into a blessing. Well, we see God's promise. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. He's right there, right? He said that he would do these things. He would cause good to be done out of evil. So, but here's the thing. He's still in the dungeon. He's still in the dungeon. And many times when we're in a bad situation, we begin to see a little bit of light, like, okay, wow, I'm getting some favor with this jail. I'm going to be out of here soon, right? But he's still in the prison.
Not only that, but the dungeon is in the house of Potiphar.
Dungeon of the house.
So, I mean, he was number one, and now he's
Yep.
at the bottom in the same house he was the lead in.
Mhm.
That's just hard. I mean,
Yeah, it is hard. It's hard. But his trust was in the Lord. Okay. But he's a Hebrew slave, but he's running the prison in Egypt. This is
You know,
this
when
is
we know
this
the
is a
rest-
God thing, right?
When we know the rest of the story, and we probably all do, God is working his plan.
That's the point, isn't it?
He is working, he's at
glorify
all
himself.
times.
Glorify himself. And Joseph is trusting
He
in
is.
the Lord, right?
No, he doesn't know,
he
God
doesn't know
knows.
the rest of the story.
Right. And can we? And the question is, can we trust God if we don't even know what His plan is in the near future?
It's got to be our faith, hasn't it?
Yeah. What happens if you're a believer, you're a Christian? What if America collapses?
It's going to.
What if it collapses? Are you still going to believe in God? You're going to trust Him for what His plan is in all of this?
Amen.
Okay. All right. Well, that may be tested. That may be tested.
There are believers in this world today that are in those very same situations where their nations have
That's right.
the
That's
dogs.
right. Yeah. And
They're faithful, some giving their very lives.
that's right.
But God is still there. and
God
he's
is still
working.
God is with them,
He's working his plan.
and His grace is sufficient.
It's
That's
just so really, really scary because we've grown up in this wonderful, beautiful country.
Yep.
And we've taken it for granted. And now we see it pretty much falling apart in front of our eyes. You've got China, which I'm afraid that, and I'm honestly, it's an honest fear. I mean, it's kind of, it's like China attack. I can just see now. China attacks Taiwan. We defend Taiwan. The China invades us and attacks us. That is a scary thing.
Can be a scary thing.
It's terrifying.
That's
And my
right.
biggest fear is, what if that happens? What if I'm hauled in front of whomever I'm hauled in and told that if you don't reject Christ, you're gonna burn to death. I mean, my fear is like, do I have enough courage to trust God to stand and say, I can't reject Him, go ahead and fry me? I mean, and not in that
And-
sense, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah, and
That's
that's exactly
scary.
that's really the point as we're going through Genesis and we see somebody like Joseph.
Very scary.
The question comes to us: Are you there yet? Are you ready in case
I'm afraid
God
I'm
might
not.
use you in this situation
I'm
the
scared
same way
I'm
He
not.
uses Joseph? You know, it's a scary situation.
Mm-hmm.
Will you be faithful even in the jaws of the lions? You know, will you remain
Scary.
faithful? And as this part, Joseph was not rescued from the scary parts, but God was with him in the scary parts. That's what makes all the difference, isn't it? Now, if you walk into the scary parts without God, or you think that God is not with you, or whatever, well, you're to be pitied. But where is your relationship with God? Are you maintaining that walk with Him, that relationship with Him? Are you growing in Him on a daily basis so that when or if those types of things do happen to you, are you prepared with joy to stand for your Lord no matter what?
Sometimes it's not as grandiose
Sinister.
and obvious as, will you reject Christ or whatever, go
Mm-hmm.
to jail. Sometimes it's, will you turn a blind eye to what's going on at work? Because if you do, you'll get a promotion or you'll keep your job. And if you
True.
don't,
True.
you will lose this promotion or you might lose your job or you will lose your friendship. So sometimes it's a little, it's just not as
Less
obvious
sinister, yeah.
sometimes. Yeah, but it's still the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
On a
kind
different
of,
scale.
yes, exactly. But it's still the very same thing.
Mhm.
I mean, I've known people like that because they were
Yep.
not willing to turn a blind eye and to say, yes, I'll go along with this and I won't say anything. They lost their job.
I know.
That's a scary place to be too.
Here's a reality that I'm not faced with it yet, but there's a boy in our school who's basically a transgender. He's turning into a girl. And it's like, would I have the wisdom, the courage, and the understanding to stand up if push comes to shove and say, no, that's not right. we can't support that. Like if he was talking to me and wanted to know, well,
What do you think?
what do I feel? Am I going to have the courage to say, you're not a girl, you're a boy. You don't have the concept and understanding of what it feels like to be a girl because you're not one. It's like, and I know it's like that could cost me my job.
It could. Those
And
those
so
are
those
very
things that I'm
those are very real
that
situations.
scares me. That's like, am I going to be able to be able to say something that I should say against it? Or am I going to be like kept quiet and not say? That's scary.
I think one of the great things that we need to develop in us is a love and compassion for people such as these situations, and so that we can address them with the love of Christ, and then possibly lead them to a knowledge of Christ, and that's what's really going to change a person's heart. Okay, all right. But anyway, he's in prison, but God soon is going to be bringing a couple of more people into the prison, and things are going to look up for Joseph. He's going to rise up out of the prison. He's going to go all the way to second command of the whole land. Wow. What a roller coaster Joseph is going through. But he's great inspiration to us. But the parallels with Christ are just many, because he goes to his own does not receive him and actually kills him, just like Christ is a precursor, and we're getting prepared for the coming of the Messiah, I think, through him. All right, great. It's time for us to bring this part to a close. We'll go on further next time. Let's stand and sing. May God may all who come behind us find us faithful. And we'll pray and then we'll go. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. May the fire of our devotion light their way. May the footprints that we lead them to believe, and the lives we live inspire them to obey. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. Amen. Bob, would you close us?
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we give you thanks and praise. I think back at the video we watched earlier about joy. Father, you bring joy to our lives in so many different ways, from our families, our friends, our church family, the work that we do. It's all about you bringing joy in our lives, and I thank you for that. Father, and the challenges that you set in tonight's lesson, will we be ready to stand up and fight for you and do what is right? So, Father, please give us the strength, the fortitude, and everything we need, Father, to follow in your footsteps and do as you would like. In Christ's name.